This podcast is brought to you by Ranch Vision, the software ranchers use to boost profits and make better decisions.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rich Brazil. I am the founder of Ranch Vision. This program was designed for producers like you. It's a unique, one-of-a-kind, forward-looking software program that enables you to see the results of your management decisions months and years into the future, from your herd numbers to your replacement costs, break-even values, enterprise efficiency, your profit and loss, your cash flow, and so much more. With this program, you can move forward with confidence into the future. Ranch Vision isn't a historical record-keeping program like all the other programs you might have seen. It looks forward. It is a very challenging, very competitive industry, and every ranch business is unique, has different variables, different opportunities, different constraints. Ranch Vision was designed to take uncertainty out of your future, to enable you to plan to profit. Please go to our website to learn more, www.ranchvision.io. Grazing livestock and just grazing animals in general are a significant part of the planet. That really is the planet.
The average age of the farmer in America is 58 years old. That is not sustainable.
We've been hit with water curtailments. We've been hit with low prices by the conditions, by the rain, by the lamb crop, by the calf crop.
I heard Native American gentlemen say, wilderness, that's an invention of the white man, because we took care of this land.
Sometimes fighting doesn't mean shouting and screaming and pounding your fist. Sometimes it's just putting your boots on and being there for work the next day.
It is, or the American people think to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves. I believe they are. My opponents do not. I believe in the right of the people.
There are cowboys still around. You just probably don't see them because we're working all the time.
I'm Keely Brazil Cavello, and this is America on One.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Read with On One. I've closely covered, as many of you know, the removal of the ranching families from Point Reyes National Seashore since January of last year. Next week, that story hits a very dark milestone and an ending of sorts. So it felt like a good time to take a retrospective look at what happened start to finish, what we've learned so far, and what lies ahead. I wanted to share with you today the whole arc, the whole story from my coverage as it happens in one place for the first time. This is everything you need to know about what happened on Point Reyes and why it matters to you wherever you live in the United States. I want to dive in quickly with the update. Here's where it stands now. All but 2 of the bought out ranching families on Point Reyes have left. I spoke with Albert Strauss. He is the founder of Strauss Family Creamery in Marin County. You may be familiar with his products in your grocery store. 2 of his supplying dairies were on Point Reyes, and he has lost both of them. So this hits very close to home. This shows you just how connected our supply chain is and how much of a loss every single farm is. He is absolutely gutted. He's devastated by what has happened, and he is feeling the impacts throughout his community. Even more than his business, he's mourning the community that he is losing in Marin County. He told me that they've lost over 200 people between the farm families and the farm workers. Schools look like they may be closing. These are small country schools that lost a lot of students. The farmers market is dying. He said, "We're losing our whole community." Quote, "In Marin County, we had 64 dairies in 1976. We're down to 13 now," end quote. I also spoke with the Lunny family. They've been here for 4 generations. Patrick Lunny said, quote, "Not long ago, I felt as though our family's beef ranch was one of the most magical places on earth. 4 generations being together, sharing a passion of raising beef and working with the land, developing long-lasting, deep friendships with the families on neighboring dairies and ranches that went back generations. All that joy has disappeared," end quote. Patrick and his wife Tila took their 8-month-old son just last weekend to see the old home, which now stands empty. Quote, "Seeing the abandoned buildings left to crumble, our yards overrun by uncontrolled vegetation, brought on feelings of shock that I was not prepared for. Seeing someone else's cows grazing the very pastures we were forced to vacate was a painful reminder that my son will not be able to share the same privilege I had of growing up on the Lunny Ranch and carrying on the dream his great-great-grandfather started," end quote. For other families, they haven't been back to Point Reyes. It's still too raw to revisit. Jolynn Mendoza McClellan told me, quote, "It's too painful to go back. I have not been out there since our animals left," end quote. The last two families on Point Reyes will be gone by August 1st. The peninsula feels haunted. Locals describe it as eerie and quiet. Albert Strauss hasn't been back either. Quote, "It's too depressing. There's nothing there," end quote. So what happened here? If you're not familiar with this story, in the waning days of the Biden administration, officials at Point Reyes National Seashore announced a deal had been made behind closed doors. 11 ranching families on 12 properties would be leaving. Their historic leases with the National Park Service, promised as part of the permanent design of the seashore when it first became federal land in 1962, would be transferred wholesale to the Nature Conservancy, a large and well-funded NGO. While the move generated national outrage and attention, for locals in Sonoma and Marin counties, the impact has been very tangible. Removing a dozen farms and ranches in one fell swoop has put farm workers out of jobs, shrunk schools, devastated local supply chains, and looks to change the face of this storied agriculture and organic agriculture community forever, as I detailed. So how did we get here? How did the federal government end more than a century and a half of ranching on land it once promised would stay in agriculture forever? To answer that, I have to take you back, not to January 2025 when the deal was announced and I first started tracking this story, but all the way back to the beginning, because this story did not start with a lawsuit. It started with a promise. Part 1, the promise. In February of last year, I wrote a piece called Ghost Coast because readers kept asking me the same question. Why did the Point Reyes ranchers sell their land to the government in the first place? The truth is, they never wanted to. The story of Point Reyes National Seashore is one of a wealthy, disconnected urban elite separating working families from farmland for their own personal recreational use. The government's current actions to remove these families once and for all is really the inevitable culmination of an effort that began almost a century ago. Quote, "All of our families were essentially threatened with eminent domain. We did not want to sell, but sold out of necessity. We did it under the understanding that we would be leased back the land indefinitely," end quote. This is what the daughter of one of the Point Reyes ranchers told me on condition of anonymity. This effort she's talking about began back in the 1930s as the wealthy residents of the San Francisco Bay Area searched for recreational areas close to their urban centers. They soon settled on Point Reyes, where immigrant families had ranched and farmed for decades, scratching out a hardscrabble life on the windswept peninsula. Ranching there goes back to the Spanish mission days. After the gold rush, farmers began operating dairies and creameries to serve the burgeoning San Francisco population about 30 miles away. By the mid-1800s, wealthy San Francisco landowners cordoned the land into 30 dairies named by letters of the alphabet, from A Ranch near the lighthouse to Z Ranch by the Mount Wittenberg Peak. Their tenants were immigrants from the Azores, Ireland, and Switzerland. Eventually, those tenants were able to buy the ranches and dairies that they worked on. In his book, Ranching on the Point Reyes Peninsula, local historian D.S. Livingston documents a pioneer existence with no electricity or telephone. Zena Cabral, the widow of dairyman Joseph Mendoza, put it this way, quote, "To tell you of the hardships, well, the only thing I can say is there were no facilities of any kind. There were no roads, there was no school. We had to make money to pay the taxes, to pay the interest, and to pay the mortgage, and to pay the teacher, besides food and clothing and everything. We worked awfully hard, and I'm not ashamed to tell you that every bit of that land was acquired by the sweat of our brow," end quote. When park supporters from the Bay Area joined with the Sierra Club to elicit public pressure and funds from all over the country, Zena traveled to Washington, D.C. to plead her case for her community before Congress. Her 1961 speech before Congress received national attention. Listen to her words. They were spoken 65 years ago, and they read like prophecy. Quote, "I was not born in this country. I was born in Europe. But since I was a child, I wanted to come to America, to the land where there was respect for human dignity, the land of the free, where the minorities would not be trampled on, where there would be no dictators. Point Reyes is where my children were born and my grandchildren were raised. Now I'm faced with the possibility of losing everything that I've worked for. The strangest thing is that I was never approached. Everything was done underhanded. Nobody ever came to me to ask, do you want to sell your property for a park? If my ranches would be taken for defense, well, you have to sacrifice, but it's for the benefit of all, for the benefit of my family as well as for the others. But for recreation, what kind of recreation did I have when I was a youngster? Work and save so my children would have a sense of security and heritage that I felt belonged to them. Now every inch of my land is supposed to disappear. End quote. Despite the ranchers' entreaties, President John F. Kennedy authorized the creation of the National Seashore in September 1962. The land would officially become a national seashore in 1972. Seeking to avoid development and protect the agricultural heritage of the area, locals cautiously supported the plan, provided the government would guarantee long-term leaseback for the ranchers and dairymen whose land was seized. That was the deal. That was always the deal. The families sold under threat of eminent domain, and in exchange, the government promised the agricultural heritage of Point Reyes would be a permanent feature of the park, with long-term leases ensuring its continuation. Keep that promise in mind because the rest of the story is really about how it was broken. Part 2, the warning. In my reporting, I have learned that what happened at Point Reyes was not unprecedented, and it did not happen without warning. In fact, a Park Service insider told us exactly what the Park Service was up to almost 2 decades ago. In 2006, a former park superintendent of the Channel Islands off the coast of California named Tim Setnica wrote a 3-part whistleblower tell-all series for the Santa Barbara News Press. This series is shocking. I was able to get my hands on it. Setnica had spent his entire career inside the National Park Service. And in that series, he describes in his own words how the agency, how the National Park Service worked to remove the Vail family's cattle ranch from Santa Rosa Island, one of the Channel Islands. He described what he called the agency's secretive and suspect management practices. He laid out a playbook. Here's Setnica describing how the Park Service used water quality as a weapon. Keep in mind, this is a Park Service superintendent writing about his own actions. Quote, to aid in our quest for ways to lever the Vail's cattle ranch on Santa Rosa Island to reduce deer and elk numbers, we contacted the Regional Water Quality Board in San Luis Obispo. We expressed our concerns about water quality on the dozen or so streams on Santa Rosa. We took these water board officials to the island and showed them the worst possible cases of cows in the creeks. And it worked. Within 2 years, the Regional Water Quality Board issued the state of California's first ever cleanup or abatement order against the National Park Service. So we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars documenting that island streams which have cattle on and alongside their banks are more heavily polluted than small stream areas where cattle were fenced out. We proved and documented the obvious with taxpayer funds and gave the information to the Water Board, which in turn used it to hammer the Park Service and our tenants, as they referred to the Vails. End quote. The Vails had been promised a long-term lease. The Park Service reneged. Al Vail, the family patriarch, asked a question that no one in the agency could answer. Quote, how come when you wanted the island, you kissed our asses, and now, after you got it, you're trying to put a sharp stick in our eye? End quote. After 90 years of ranching, the last steers were shipped off Santa Rosa Island in 1998. Al Vail passed away within months of his forced removal. On nearby Santa Cruz Island, the story was even darker. In 1997, the Park Service sent a Black Hawk helicopter and 20 armed officers to raid the last holdout ranch on the island, ostensibly over alleged artifact violations. Officers in ski masks and body armor pulled a 15-year-old girl out of bed and held her in shackles. The raid happened to coincide with the Park Service seizing the land of Francis Guarini, an 82-year-old patriarch whose family had owned the last piece of private property in the park since 1869 and who wanted nothing more than a fair price for his land. Congress had passed what's called a legislative taking to force the sale. Guarini himself said the raid was contrived to justify the taking. Tim Setnica, the superintendent of the Channel Island Park, signed off on that Santa Cruz raid. But by 2014, he had seen enough. He held a meeting at a Marin County school and he told the ranchers of Point Reyes to their faces that what he had witnessed on the Channel Islands was not an isolated case. Like the Vales, the Point Reyes families had been assured long-term agricultural leases. Setnica said the promise was empty. He said the National Park Service was coming for them. The Point Reyes Light wrote at the time, quote, Mr. Setnica framed the Park Service as a clandestine government agency that ignores data and is hostile to ranching. According to Mr. Setnica, much of the interagency work was more or less orchestrated to help bring about the end of ranching, end quote. Community members tell me they remember hearing Setnica's warning. They had hoped he was overreacting. He wasn't. And the first proof came not from a cattle ranch, but from an oyster farm. In 2012, former Interior Secretary Ken Salazar announced the closure of the Drakes Bay oyster farm on Point Reyes operated by the Lunny family. This sustainable family business produced over half the oysters in the state of California. Insiders say the decision was based on bunk science and pressure from outside environmental groups. A source with knowledge, who spoke to me on condition of anonymity, told me the following, quote, the science was totally bogus. Oysters are actually positive for sea life because they filter the ocean water. Even the National Academy of Sciences got involved and told them the science was not legit. End quote. As the Park Service announced it would not renew the oyster farm's lease, Salazar reassured the nervous ranchers on Point Reyes that they had nothing to worry about. His words at the time, quote, ranching operations have a long and important history on the Point Reyes Peninsula and will be continued at Point Reyes National Seashore. End quote. In 2019, Kevin Lunny stood at the White House next to President Trump and said out loud what everyone on the peninsula feared.
With us today is Kevin Lunny, whose company was forced out of business through the terrible practice of a certain way of government handling of things. Not fair, not right. Kevin, please come up and discuss it. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
My name's Kevin Lunny. I'm a third-generation cattle rancher at the Point Reyes National Seashore in California. About several years ago, we also were the owners of the Drakes Bay Oyster Farm, a sustainable family business where we produced nearly half of all the oysters in the state of California. Wow. In 2014, the National Park Service launched a National Environmental Policy Act process that cost millions of dollars and lasted over 8 years, and the National Park Service forced our oyster farm out of business. And if that wasn't enough for our family and our community, today, the rest of agriculture, which includes about another 24 ranching family farm businesses within the National Seashore, are facing the exact same process. Our fear is that that process could ultimately be facing, and those families may be facing, what the oyster farm faced. And so I'm here, Mr. President, thanking you for calling this meeting together so we can have this discussion. We urge you to continue your good work in following these policies and making sure these federal policies are managed in a way that family farmers and ranchers like us can actually benefit and survive these procedures, and so they're not just for federal agencies that have pre-decided what they want before the process has begun, and for professional litigants that abuse the process. Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much. Beautiful job. Thank you. Thank you. And the business, is the business gone now?
The business is gone, 20 million oysters destroyed.
Wow. They forced you out of business?
Yes.
So I have to say, Kevin, I know what you've been through. I read a little bit about it, and I've heard about it also, and it's very sad. But we thank you both for being here very much. Really, thank you very much. No American should ever face such persecution from their own government.
Trump vowed to protect ranching on Point Reyes. He said,
my first executive order will require agencies to publish guidance documents online so that small businesses and everyday citizens can easily find them. Agencies will have to seek public input on the most important guidance, and the whole process will be closely overseen by the White House. I'm going to have somebody right here in the White House looking at it, Kevin, so this doesn't happen to other people. You're very brave to be here. I really think it's incredible. I really mean it.
Then, as we know, Donald Trump lost his re-election bid in 2020, and a new administration took over. Lunny's fear proved prescient. Part 3, the lawfare. Here's how it happened, not with a Black Hawk this time, with lawyers. In 2016, a coalition of environmental groups sued the National Park Service over the presence of ranching on Point Reyes. The Evans and Nyman families chose to intervene along with their neighbors. Years of public comment, third-party scrutiny, and exhaustive environmental review resulted in a clear recommendation. 20-year leases for the ranchers should be granted by the Park Service. Let me say that again because it matters. The government's own environmental review, the one the environmental groups actually demanded, concluded that the ranchers should stay with renewed 20-year leases. The ranchers won. Kevin Lunny described what happened next. We told the Park Service, we'll support you, we'll work with you, we will meet this higher bar of natural resource conservation, we will show that it can be done right, let's do this. And the plaintiffs sued again on that plan because they didn't like the outcome, end quote. The groups suing were the Center for Biological Diversity, the Resource Renewal Institute, and Western Watersheds Project. When the process produced an answer they didn't like Kevin said, they simply sued again. And this time, something changed. The case went into closed-door mediation, and a new player entered the room, the Nature Conservancy, one of the largest private conservation organizations in the world, with over $1 billion in annual revenue and the largest network of privately conserved land in the nation. David Evans, the last rancher on the peninsula, watched it happen from the outside. He and the Nymans had declined to join the second round of litigation. He told me, quote, "At that time, my wife and I reassessed. Should we pay an attorney, intervene? We just thought, unlike the rest of our neighbors, we're just going to work with the Park Service and have faith they'll be there for us." End quote. That faith was not rewarded. But before I get to what happened with David Evans, you need to understand what the pressure looked like for the families inside the mediation. An anonymous source with close experience of the Park Service in a similar situation described the pattern to me. Quote, "These nonprofit groups all seem to have a playbook. They find vulnerable people who can't afford ongoing litigation, ranchers, farmers, developers, and attack them. They sue with the goal of forcing them off the land, knowing the ranchers can't fight back. The ranchers can't do infrastructure repairs. They face extreme pressure. These groups have unlimited money. After they force the victim to settle and leave, they take massive amounts of taxpayer-funded settlement money." End quote. Attorney Andrew Giacomini, who represents the farm workers on Point Reyes, put it more bluntly, quote, "It's environmental terrorism. I believe there is a total conspiracy going on with the environmental groups and the National Park Service to end ranching on national parks, and this is their playbook." End quote. And he pointed out something that has stuck with me through this entire investigation. The government had a winnable case. The environmental review was on its side. The law was on its side. Giacomini told me, quote, "The National Park Service chose not to win." When does the federal government fold when it has a winnable case? When it wants to. They held all the cards, they played those cards, they put pressure on the ranchers and got exactly what they wanted. Pretending they're a bystander, it's such a lie. End quote. Staring down the barrel of crushing litigation, the ranchers took the buyout the Nature Conservancy offered. Every family who joined the lawsuit would leave. Every family signed a non-disclosure agreement. To this day, not one of them can tell you what happened in that room. The deal was announced in January 2025 in the very last days of the Biden administration, 11 days before Trump's inauguration. The timing was not lost on anyone. I asked Giacomini directly whether he believed the settlement was rushed to slip under the wire before Trump could change leadership at the Department of the Interior. His answer was succinct. Quote, 100%. End quote. Part 4, the funeral. 4 days after the announcement, Congressman Jared Huffman hosted what he called a town hall at the Dance Palace in Point Reyes Station. I called it what it was, a town hall in name only. The activists had already won. The papers were signed. Now the community was invited to a discussion, but it was too late. This was a formality. Because of the gag order, the ranchers could not speak to me for that story, so I told it through Kathy Teresh, a Sonoma County dairy woman who has twice nearly lost her own farm and who went to bear witness to what happened to her neighbors. The Dance Palace has a capacity of 190 people. Young families gathered and elderly men and women, the grandchildren of Swiss and Azorean immigrants, part of an agricultural tradition on Point Reyes older than the state of California itself. Ghosts of the community soon lost. They were dressed in winter layers, wearing muck boots. It was rainy season and cows have to be fed, even on the day of your own funeral. They filled the room. They filled the standing area around the room. They filled the lawn outside. Quote, "It was one of the most powerful meetings I've ever attended," Kathy told me. The support for the ranchers was overwhelming, end quote. Kevin Lunny stood up and gave a speech that I then posted to social media where it was viewed hundreds of thousands of times.
I hadn't prepared anything because I didn't know I was going to be asked to speak. I thought I was going to answer questions. We do have a different perspective of how we got here. We come from very, very different perspectives. The Park Service and the plaintiffs have a perspective, and the ranchers have a perspective, okay?
He was careful. He had to be.
I have very strict guardrails and a muzzle on what I can and can't say, and I think everybody knows that.
And then he described what it cost.
It became an untenable situation. Our choice is, if we don't agree to settlement, we continue with litigation, and we are absolutely in a minority. We entered into this having the deepest sorrow you could ever imagine. This is, I couldn't even tell my dad about this decision when it was time. He's 94 years old, he lives next door on the ranch, still helps with the cows, and I had to tell him, we decided that we're gonna have to leave. It's unimaginable. It's unimaginable how we sit there and we talk to our own children and our grandchildren who love these cows and love the ranch. It's who we are. It's our existence. It's our identity. And we have to walk away from it. And so it's enormously emotional. And I'm sorry, didn't mean to. Okay. I didn't prepare. But you know, I see that this could have ended differently. I know it could have ended differently. But we had the wrong people in the room making decisions and everybody else not allowed in. And just sad to see such a profound change in our community with almost zero community input. And
Kevin Lunny closed by pointing out that the mediation had not resulted in a compromise. The only sacrifices were on the rancher's side.
Mediation, you'd expect give and take on both sides. We're hearing people say, oh, there's give and take on both sides. I want to hear from Chance, what sacrifice have you made?
Yeah.
I want to really hear the give and take. The way I see it is, from that baseline, this community gives. Our families give. Give up our home, our identity. There was a give on the rancher side, and I want to hear about the give on the plaintiff side. Thank you. I'm finished.
Part 5. The receipts. Throughout all of this, everything you have heard, the Park Service insisted it was a neutral party, a bystander to litigation between ranchers and environmentalists. That was the official story. Then journalist Chris Bray filed a Freedom of Information Act request, and the government's own emails came back. On January 9th, 2025, just over a week before President Trump's inauguration, Deputy Solicitor for Parks and Wildlife Sarah Krakoff forwarded the email announcing the rancher's exit to her colleagues. She wrote, quote, "Big win for NPS, poor, and conservation. Nice one to go out on, y'all." End quote. That last sentence was followed by 3 exclamation points. National Park Service Director Charles Sams replied, Nicely done. Barbara Goodyear, a former interior lawyer and management consultant for the Park Service during the lawsuit, celebrated the end of a long road. These are the so-called neutral bystanders. David Evans, when he saw those emails, said what every rancher in the county was probably thinking. Quote, "I'm sorry, Park Service workers don't get to celebrate ranchers leaving. That, to me, smells terrible. These are public employees whose job is to implement what Congress envisioned for Point Reyes National Seashore. There's something wrong here. I can't help but think the green groups achieved what they achieved through capitulation from the Park Service, and that needs to be weeded out. It's collusion, it's conspiracy, and it's illegal," end quote. And the money trail kept getting stranger. In October, I reported that the Nature Conservancy had secured a $10 million grant from the state of California to restore the land, and that the funds were earmarked in the state budget 6 months before the buyout was finalized. The ranchers were never told this grant was available. Kevin Lunny told the Press Democrat, quote, "It's shocking to me. All I know is when the Nature Conservancy appropriated this money, it was far from being settled," end quote. He said that if the ranchers had known that $10 million existed, the entire negotiation might have gone differently. Part of the plaintiff's claims were air quality and water quality problems. $10 million fixes a lot of fencing and a lot of manure infrastructure. Quote, "Once this was approved, it should have been made known to everyone in mediation that there are 2 ways to use $10 million. One is if we leave, and one is if we don't leave. And that didn't happen," end quote. So who championed that state funding? Directors at the Nature Conservancy told the Press Democrat it was Congressman Jared Huffman, the same congressman who brought the Nature Conservancy into the talks in the first place, the same congressman who hosted the town hall after the papers were already signed. And there was more. The Nature Conservancy had been fundraising for this outcome for years, hosting high-dollar donor dinners in Marin County mansions catered by private chefs, asking for $40 million to buy out the Point Reyes farmers. I spoke with people who attended these events. They were billed as intimate conversations about the future of Point Reyes. In April 2025, the House Committee on Natural Resources launched a formal investigation. 7 representatives signed on. The committee demanded the Nature Conservancy and the environmental groups turn over all relevant communications, and it raised the conflict of interest directly. The organization that fundraised to remove the ranchers now controls the land's future. One of the 7 representatives was Doug LaMalfa, the rice farmer and congressman from rural Northern California. He told me at the time, quote, "Farmers and ranchers provide what people need. The people of Marin and Sonoma have great love and respect for how their neighbors do so in providing for them. They know these farmers and ranchers are the best stewards of that neighboring land. These families have operated for many generations in the area and in good faith when parks first started muscling them in the early 60s, end quote. As many of you know, Congressman LaMalfa has since passed away. He was one of the few voices in Washington who consistently showed up for rural California, and that quote given to me at this time is part of his record of doing exactly that. He is sorely missed by the Northern California community. Part 6, The Last Man Standing. This brings me to David Evans. David Evans runs the last ranch on the pastoral zone of the Point Reyes Peninsula. His family has worked in agriculture there since the 1890s. His children are the 5th generation. Because he never joined the lawsuit, he was never part of the mediation, never took a buyout, and never signed a gag order. He is free to speak, and what he told me dismantles the official story piece by piece. Quote, "I want to go on the record and say I was never offered a buyout. I didn't hold out, I was held out," end quote. The Nature Conservancy's spokesperson told me the lease buyout was voluntary, that some ranchers opted to receive compensation while other ranchers are opting to stay. Evans calls that depiction disingenuous. The only 2 families left are the 2 families who were never in the room. When Evans approached the Nature Conservancy after the decision was announced, they told him there would be no buyout for him. Quote, "Why am I there? I don't think it's by coincidence. The only thing I can think is they want to have somebody to point to and say, the other ranchers could have stayed, just like David Evans. That's not true, by the way," end quote. And of his neighbors, he says, quote, "At this point, they've been so pressured. I would go so far as to say abused. They were shown an impossible lease and an impossible circumstance with no future and then offered a buyout. To call something voluntary when there was no other option is a little disingenuous, if you ask me," end quote. When the final record of decision came out, Evans discovered his own future had been written without him. His cattle numbers capped, a strange land swap proposed. The Park Service promised he could negotiate, but multiple meetings later he told me, quote, "The answer was no on every single thing. I left there going, they don't want me here. This isn't a negotiation. They purposefully gave me a future there that was very meager and unsustainable," end quote. So Evans joined the Nyman family's lawsuit against the Park Service. He's not asking to undo his neighbors' buyouts. He's asking that the land stay in agriculture as Congress promised in 1962. Quote, "Everybody who has an interest in this should read the Point Reyes Act and follow-up legislation and look at what's going on today and ask themselves some really honest questions. Is this the way it was meant to be?" End quote. And here's another part of the story. The environmental case for removing the ranchers was always thin, and the science on the ground, in fact, suggests the opposite. David Evans told me, quote, "Point Reyes isn't broken. It didn't need to be saved. I've spent more time in these fields than any staff or tourist or visitor. I can see how beneficially grazed livestock does not steal away from nature or natural communities or wildlife. It enhances it. The park's own data shows that our grazing allowed an endangered plant to thrive more so than when it wasn't being grazed. Red-legged frog populations are flourishing on grazed land. Why aren't these stories covering front pages?" End quote. He's not alone in that. Grazing ecologist Nate Chisholm spent years collecting data just over the hill from Point Reyes in the same wet coastal microclimate. 10-meter by 10-meter plots counted by a professional botanist every year. Over 6 years, his managed grazing program increased plant species per plot by 101%. Native plant cover went up 61%. Nate was one of the first guests on my podcast. I encourage you to go back and listen. When I asked him whether the Park Service was interested in his data, his answer was simple. Everybody knew the Park Service was not interested in hearing data. And his forecast for an ungrazed Point Reyes was just as simple. Run the data in reverse. Eventually, it'll all be velvet grass and coyote bush. Even the famous Thule elk lose. Chisholm points out that elk cannot handle 3-foot invasive grasses. They follow behind larger grazers. That's how they have always worked. Remove the cattle and the elk inherit a landscape they cannot graze. And then there's fire. Shalina Moreda, a 5th-generation dairy farmer in Petaluma, runs a rescue organization that evacuates animals during wildfires. She has evacuated animals from Point Reyes itself. She tells me, quote, "They are not exempt from wildfire on Point Reyes. The only thing keeping it at bay is those multi-generational farmers managing grazing out there," end quote. As of this month, July 2026, only 3 ranches are being grazed on Point Reyes. The Nature Conservancy holds a 40-year management agreement on the rest. The fuel load is growing, and we are entering yet another California wildfire season. Part 7, the power structure. The question I've been asked more than any other over 18 months of this reporting is why? Why would the government do this? I don't have a complete answer, but I can tell you what I've found, and I can tell you it goes beyond one park. Quick note, some of the locals I speak with speculate about political corruption, and it is worth mentioning. Governor Gavin Newsom and his wife, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, are now being investigated by the federal government over behested payments, donations the governor solicited from interests with business before the state and steered to nonprofits his wife runs. The Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria is said to be the single largest tribal donor in the United States. The tribe has given at least $500,000 to Siebel Newsom's nonprofit. They have a 20-year co-management agreement with Point Reyes National Seashore, signed in 2021, a unique arrangement that gives the tribe a say in how the park is run. To be clear, no charges have been filed in that investigation. The Newsoms say it is politically motivated, even though it's worth noting it started under the Biden administration. And the Great and Tribe's Point Reyes agreement predates the donation to Siebel Newsom's nonprofit by 3 years. But what the locals are pointing at is not a proven quid pro quo. It's something more diffuse and, in its way, more troubling. Quote, "Public servants aren't public servants anymore. There's a whole power structure," said one local farmer who asked to remain anonymous in my coverage. This individual is a longtime Democrat who says he is disillusioned with the party after Congressman Jared Huffman appeared to join talks on the side of NGOs to kick these ranchers out. He told me he senses a profound disconnect between the modern Democrat Party and the farmers and ranchers who feed the nation. Sarah Rolfe, a writer who is authoring a book about the Drakes Bay oyster farm closure, described the machinery to me. Quote, "The Park Service works very, very hard to maintain its ranger image. They never get their hands dirty. They farm out the work of creating and promulgating the relevant false narrative to the activists, and then they collude behind closed doors in the course of their fake lawsuits. Sue and settle. It's a known scam." End quote. Billy Thibodeau grazes sheep and goats for fire control all over this stretch of coastline, past the abandoned Victorian farmhouses of what I've come to call the Ghost Coast. I've asked nearly everyone I interviewed why the Park Service would want this. What is the motivation? Nobody had an answer for me except Billy. She said, quote, "It's an agenda to get people off the land. It's a movement to extract people from our most valuable resource, which is the land. This land is power. Ranchers hold a lot of power. The government is afraid of it." End quote. Obviously, I can't prove Billy's theory, but what I can tell you is that the pattern she's describing has now played out in documented detail on Santa Rosa Island, on Santa Cruz Island, at Drakes Bay, and on Point Reyes. Same agency, same playbook. At some point, a pattern stops being a coincidence and becomes a policy. That question, whether there is something systemic inside the National Park Service and the agencies around it, is one I am going to keep investigating. Point Reyes may just be one piece of data in a much larger story. Part 8, what's next? So where does it stand today, and is there any road back? Karen Bud Fallon, Associate Deputy Secretary at the Department of the Interior, met with community members in April of this year in a town hall format near Point Reyes. Over 600 people showed up. Bud Fallon asked Albert Strauss to develop a proposal for a demonstration dairy. He obtained conceptual support from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and Chico State as part of a vision for next generation farmers and cheesemakers on Point Reyes. So now they wait, hoping Trump's Department of the Interior will hear them. Strauss tells me Bud Fallon was gracious and understanding at that town hall, and there is a legal path. As the House committee itself noted, under the Seashore's enabling legislation, the Secretary of the Interior retains the right to lease federal lands at Point Reyes for agricultural use, regardless of how the lawsuit ended. The door Congress opened in 1962 is still technically open. Strauss is among many locals who hope the Trump administration will open grazing lease applications on Point Reyes to independent producers and not just give it over to the Nature Conservancy wholesale. Strauss frames what's at stake far beyond one county. Quote, "Livestock numbers have declined significantly over the past several decades, while wildfire risk has increased dramatically. 50 years ago, we had 132 million cattle. Now we have around 80 million. Active land management matters." End quote. And Shalina Moreta frames what's at stake for everyone who still lives near a working landscape anywhere in this country. Quote, "The fact that this happened right under our noses infuriates everyone around here. It's not what anyone wanted, yet it happened anyway. Everybody wonders when their neighbor will be hit next. It's an unsettling feeling." End quote. So in closing, to quickly summarize this story, Point Reyes became federal land in 1962 with a promise to the farm families who had managed it for generations and opposed its seizure that they and their descendants would be protected. The government moved forward with taking the land despite their protests, but they told them that the storied agricultural heritage of Point Reyes would stay a permanent feature of the park with long-term leases. That promise has now been broken. Zena Cabral stood before Congress in 1961 and she asked why her land had to disappear for someone else's recreation. Today we're left asking why these farms and ranches had to disappear for an NGO's enrichment, for someone's ideology. 65 years later, the community that has always supported agriculture was not given a voice in this decision. The last two families in Point Reyes will be gone by August 1st. The peninsula is quiet. Patrick Lunny's son will grow up somewhere else. Kevin Lunny's father is 95 now, and the cows are gone. Billy Thibodeau says this area of California is special, not in spite of generations of ranchers, but because of them. Quote, "I graze land all over this area, both north and south of San Francisco, and this exact location has the healthiest soil I've ever seen in my life. This is special, special land. The ranchers have built topsoil over generations, and it is so valuable. People don't see that. Ruminant grazing has built this topsoil. The Park Service is disrespecting it, end quote. This has been The Read with Keely Brazil Covello. You can read all of the reporting that I just touched the surface of at AmericaOn1.com. Search Point Reyes. All 18 or so stories will come up along with interviews with people relevant to this case. I am not done reporting on this story and on what's going on at the Park Service. I have a lot of open questions remaining, particularly about what happened at the Channel Islands. So keep following back. I have more coming in the weeks ahead. Thank you, as always, for your support. I'm only able to do this because of you, because of subscribers who support me. So if you want to join the fight, please do so at AmericaOn1.com. Please read this reporting, share this story, an important, heartbreaking, and ignored story that matters deeply for our country. Thank you for listening.